be willing to grab the mic. So there's a mic over here, there's a mic over there, there's a mic over there. And if you want, you could just sit beside Marco and just, grab the mic over there. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to talk today. And this session is called Cybersecurity Challenges Ahead. How would you shape regulation to address changing technology? My name is Louise Marie Urel. I am currently with EuroDIG Institute, which is a think tank, multidimensional security think tank based in Brazil, but I'm based in the UK, so kind of like a global-ish citizen. But I'm very happy to have you all here. I would like to first specifically thank Tatiana Tropina for being such a supportive person all throughout this process of helping grab people and just have them over here. So I'm really thankful for all of our panelists, actually our key participants, because we're all participants today. And I'd just like to start out because I think this workshop is pretty much a follow-up from the discussions that we had yesterday at the plenary. So looking at 2030, looking ahead, thinking about what do we mean with regulation of emerging technologies, and thinking about what are the constraints in terms of, dealing with security, dealing with values such as accountability, transparency. And some of the things that we heard yesterday at that plenary was such as we are looking for the perfect legislation, and we're looking for a regulation in the present. Another thing that was said was, if you want your policy to endure, you need to look to the past and to the present. And now we just got back from a very interesting plenary session that talked about international cybersecurity norms, talking about the UNGGE, the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, talking about the Open-Ended Working Group, talking about different norms at the international level, talking about a bit about cooperation at the regional level. So how do we understand actually the trickle down of these norms? How do we understand that, how to implement them? As Mariette was saying, we have a very good understanding, specifically at the internet governance community, of what a multi-stakeholder process is, and we're looking always at the process, we're looking at accountability, transparency in the processes, but are we talking about implementation? So this panel is very much focused on bringing us back to, let's talk about the feasibility. Let's talk about the implementation. Let's talk about, should we regulate emerging technologies? Shouldn't we regulate it? How do we go about, the gap between these international norms, these international cybersecurity processes, and what happens at kind of like the operational level, what happens at, the technological level. So I'd like to challenge you today to join me in this conversation. And first of all, I'd just like to present, please feel free to join at the table. I'd like to present first Wolfgang Kleinwachter. He is a commissioner over at and sorry if I didn't say that correctly, my German is really bad, but he's a commissioner over at the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. I'd like also to present you to Marco. Marco, please help me on your last name. Hogewoning. Also bad in pronouncing the last name, but thank you so much, Marco. Marco is a policy advisor over at RIPE NCC, and Jaren Unal from ISOC. So I'd like to start out by asking Wolfgang. Wolfgang, please take my seat over there, because I think it might be easier, but yeah, I'll pass it over to you. So Wolfgang, tell me, how do you see, I'll give you the mic, so no worries. So how do you see the progression between the discussions that we were having at the plenary, specifically in terms of cyber norms and the international level? How do we make this more palpable? How do we bring this, to our everyday reality? How do we ensure that these processes actually are effective?
That's the easy question and difficult to translate into reality. Internet governance debates are like the Mississippi. It flows, it flows, it flows, and still 1,000 miles to New Orleans. And if you arrive in New Orleans, you have a delta, and you cannot oversee, how many small rivers are there. So that's very complex. And insofar, the debate we had just in the previous session was very helpful to discuss this multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism, which concluded in the recommendation. It's nonsense to have this debated in an ideological way, because you need all stakeholders on the table in their respective roles. I think this was the interesting language which was introduced already in the Tunis agenda when the working group on internet governance defined what internet governance is. They said it has to be multi-stakeholder. But the stakeholders operate in their respective roles. That means there are issues, because we have so many issues. There are issues which has to be settled by a concrete stakeholder group. The technical community has a special responsibility. The business have their own responsibility. Civil society had their own responsibility. And certainly governments have their own responsibilities. That means there are issues which should be negotiated within the stakeholder groups, but embedded in a multi-stakeholder environment. That means no stakeholder alone can come to a final conclusion or final decision, without having a consulting process or whatsoever, by taking into account the positions of the other stakeholders. So no stakeholder can substitute the other stakeholder. Civil society cannot substitute governments. Business cannot substitute governments. Government cannot substitute business. So but you have to have the various perspectives. There is no single answer to an internet issue. You can have various perspectives, and you can come to reasonable outcomes only if you take the various perspectives on board, and on basis of this, let's say, broader knowledge, then you can come to a sustainable decision by people who have a mandate to decide. In the IETF, it's a technical person, but the technical people would be stupid to ignore the broader environment and just to do the RFC, in their own silo. And the same, with the group of governmental experts in the United Nations. It's an intergovernmental body, and probably governments, under certain circumstances, have to talk to each other. But they would be stupid to ignore the debate outside the UN headquarters and not to have these open consultations. And so let's wait and see what these two processes, which will start now in September in New York, will produce. But I think the pressure from the community should be, we live in this one world, and we do not live in, let's say, closed communities anymore. And insofar to have this, let's say, conceptual discussion about the how to combine in an effective way multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism. So Guterres, the Secretary General, has used the language inclusive multilateralism. I think this is interesting. He has also used the language smart regulation. That means smart regulation means there's no need to regulate everything, but in certain circumstances it's good to have, let's say, binding legislation. Then you can have more non-binding voluntary codes and things like that. So that means you have to work with the full spectrum of opportunities. And so insofar, this is, ahead of us is a lot of discussion. The 2020s will be very interesting. We need small, concrete outputs, but do not expect that somebody has a silver bullet and will settle the problems within the next 2 years. Thank you.
Yes, no, that's perfect. And I'd just like to bring a point from our previous discussion, which I think is very interesting, and I want to get back to you also, Wolfgang, which is, we had that poll, right? And one of the answers that we had was that participants had agreed that we need more norms for state behavior and regulation for corporate behavior. So do we need more regulation? That's perhaps my question. What do you think, Wolfgang?
Yes and no, it depends from the case. I think in previous terms, in the industrial age, we had a regulation and it put every issue under this broad regulation. In the information age, I would build the regulation around the issue. So, and there are issues which needs precise regulation. There are issues, where you could say general framework is better. This offers more flexibility. Certainly, if you come to various security-related issues, and we will discuss a little bit later, certifications for products, which have a lot of vulnerabilities and could risk life, then probably here you need strong regulation. If it's just, to some guidelines for the development of AI, probably then voluntary guidelines, ethical guidelines are better. So it depends from the issue.
Thank you, Wolfgang. So I think I'm now going to pass it to Jaren. Jaren, what do you think about, well, could you share with us also a bit, what do you see that are the main technological challenges that we see ahead? We were talking about, looking at the future, looking at what's 10 years from now, and looking also in terms of regulation. Should we regulate? Shouldn't we regulate? Should we be talking about the question of regulating or not regulating? Where's the starting point? So I'd just like to hand it over to you.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I'm just asking the $1 million question.
And also, like reflecting from the Mentimeter poll from the session earlier, it's like a couple of years ago, after Snowden revelations, for example, the majority of the people, I remember a similar poll, and most of the people said that the states need to be regulated. And now after Cambridge Analytica, most of the people say that it's the companies, it's the big tech that needs to be regulated. Very little people said that the current regulatory regimes, the norms are effective. And that tells something. But does that mean that we need to re-regulate, we need to over-regulate? Because we're moving, there's this global appetite to regulate, which is understandable. We've been working for the last 2 years on a campaign on IoT security at Internet Society, which we call Trust by Design, because especially IoT is a very complex ecosystem, and privacy and security cannot be isolated from each other. So everything is strongly connected to each other. So we call it Trust by Design. Under Trust by Design campaign recently, we built a partnership with Consumers International because we were focusing on consumer IoT, which is particularly vulnerable. It's more than 60% of the market share. And there is also an economic aspect to that, which probably we can talk about that later. But what we did is about also this global appetite. We issued a survey in partnership with Consumers International. Most of the people responded with, I'm going to oversimplify this. They thought IoT devices were creepy. Yet they said they're going to buy them anyway. They also said somebody needs to do something about it. And that's somebody who the jury is still out. What we try to do, the internet is by definition a globally interdependent network of networks. So that's how the internet works. When we talk about multi-stakeholderism, it sounds like such a cliche, but it makes super sense because that's how the internet works. No single actor, even if they come up with the most, I'm a lawyer by training, so I love it. Like we can talk hours on how to craft norms and which value judgments should be embedded and everything. But by the end of the day, you need to cooperate on a global level. And this is not just some nicety that is offered by governments for civil society or technical community to sit on the table. Because simply we need each other. Everybody has a say. Everybody has to play a role in this. And what we tried to do is we started a multi-stakeholder process. It started first in Canada, including the government, private actors, civil society. And now it's spreading. Why I'm saying this? Because it works on a global level. So now we have another multi-stakeholder process going on in France. Another one has started in Senegal. Another one has just started in Uruguay. So this actually works. So this was a very, a voluntary norm developing process, mainly focusing on privacy, security, resilience, and transparency aspects, which goes on for the whole life cycle of the products. Our whole campaign was based on an Internet Society initiative, Online Trust Alliance. They built up a very substantial, detailed principles called the IoT Trust Framework. So the discussion was evolving around that, but I'm glad to see that now the Canadian process is finished. and we'll see how the implementation goes. And I think multi-stakeholderism also, I think that's, we're going to discuss that further, but if we want to have technology-proof norms, we need to be realistic, we need to have some sort of flexibility, we need it to be adaptable to changes. So these kinds of norms, which are built by consensus, by agreement for both the stakeholders, because in the IoT market in particular, the toughest part is to incentivize. And I'm also kind of scared on a personal level, I'm scared of, I agree that there is an urgency to address some issues. I agree that the governments obviously have the main duty to protect their citizens, but if you look at the G7 outcome document, for example, we are really worried about some of the proposals which are being currently discussed around the globe and also in Europe that weaken encryption, which is the strongest tool for security. And another challenge, it's not a technological challenge, but it's a mentality challenge. We still hear the I have nothing to hide argument from the general public. And also the false dichotomy of privacy versus security still exists, which is probably another issue to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I definitely agree that there is a component of education that comes together with the whole process of understanding the technology and understanding what are the effective ways for us to actually build policy. What is the kind of processes that we need, and what kind of outcome are we actually looking at? I forgot to mention, but I think one of the good things for us to think about over here is that at the international level, we talked a lot about the international norms and talked about, you know, different sets of norms that are coming up, be it at the UNGG or the GCSC proposing different packages. I think that one of the things at the European level that we have been seeing is definitely kind of like an increased attention to cybersecurity, a robustness in terms of not only institutions, but also in terms of policy. So you have the EU Cybersecurity Act that was mentioned earlier. We have also the ENISA gaining a new kind of like body, a new institutional role. But we also have, on the other hand, other proposals such as, you know, developing a blueprint for coordinating cyber attacks in Europe. So I'd like to pass over now to Marco. Marco, what are your thoughts coming from RIBE, coming from the technical community? What are your thoughts on the regulatory approach, on how do we reconcile regulation and emerging technologies, and most importantly, which is the focus of this discussion, how do we consider security and all of that, and don't end up in kind of like this endpoint, as Jaren was mentioning, between security and privacy as dichotomous. How do we go about that?
It's a tough question to answer. Yeah, I'm looking, and yes, my background is in technology, so I'm kind of looking this, and sometimes maybe in a technocratic engineering way, and I think as Jaren just said, it's what I see a lot is people reinventing the wheel. We've got something, and I think from a technical perspective, it's also look at what you have and try to improve on what you have rather than spin up another venue, institutionalize somebody else to take care of it. And I kind of want to jump a bit back to where Wolfgang kind of started off with the principles of internet governance. Each and everybody in their own respective roles. But from where I sit, what I see more and more is that we throw technology at technology. We see technology as a threat. We put more technology in to counter that threat. And what happens at the same time, what I also see is that we more and more seem to be shifting the role, where more and more of what essentially is a regulatory role is privatized. We are looking at the big corporations to regulate themselves. Yet yesterday during one of the opening sessions, and I think it was our Commissioner Maria Gabriel that said, like, self-regulation has failed. If we agree to that point where self-regulation has failed, then we have better be careful in pushing more regulation into the industry, because essentially we are telling them to self-regulate. Now, I personally don't agree that self-regulation has failed, but I think we have to understand that self-regulation actually means regulation. That means you have to stand and adhere to the norms you put on yourself. And when I hear Wolfgang call for strong regulation, and he's certainly not the only one, essentially what we're calling for is stronger enforcement. Because it's maybe not the regulation that's failed. It's probably better to look at the enforcement that failed, and whether that's the existing institutions that are lacking the capacity to understand what goes on and be effective in their enforcement, or whether we have to define new ways to enforce it. That's something we can discuss. And that was also pointed out by Jaya yesterday in the panel, was like, yeah, if we all know that product is bad, take it off the market. Stop selling it. And I do believe that there is existing regulation in product conformity that would enable us to do that. It just takes a bit of guts to say, stop here, right now. Take it off the market, go and fix it, come back when this product is safe.
Great. So Wolfgang, do you agree with Marco when he says, well, it's about the enforcement?
Yes, that's true. And here we have also a gap in the internet governance ecosystem. We do have not really dispute settling mechanisms. That means if two parties have a conflict, how they settle this. So, and you know what, the case of Germany, I criticized this German law already yesterday, is, you know, if the German government says we hate speech and fake news in the social networks, and then delegate it to Facebook to settle the issue. You know, that's not the right way to do it. So you have to have a neutral third party, which will then, you know, if there's a conflict with the governmental approach and the private sector approach, you know, decides this under neutral conditions based on norms in the law. So, and we do not have this so-called independent judiciary for cyberspace conflicts. So we can go to an ordinary court, that's clear. We have here the court, International Court of Justice in The Hague. But if you start a procedure, then probably it takes years until you have an outcome. So I would think for a lot of this very practical issues, we could be innovative and to develop and introduce new mechanisms for dispute settlement, which would contribute then to enforcement, so that companies know if they do not respect the norms, they have to pay consequences. Also, state, if they attack other states, they have to face consequences. So far, a cyber attack against another state remains without any consequences. And, you know, this is an invitation for others to say, okay, you know, we can just, you know, hack somebody in another country, and the price is rather low, which they have to be paid. You know, it's difficult to attribute and all this. We know the whole complexity, but so far we do not have a price list for wrongdoing in the internet. So a lot of wrongdoing in the internet remains without consequences. And this relates to the enforcement, but for enforcement we do not have the adequate mechanisms. Insofar, this is an invitation to be creative and to come up with something which is new. We had the domain name squatters in the 1990s when trademark and domain names were mixed. And it was a very complex issue. And then a new thing was introduced and invented. It was the UDRP and ICANN. And it works quite well. So that means hundreds of thousands of cases has been settled with this new procedure. So my plea is for a new procedure for dispute settlement mechanisms for a lot of cyber conflicts. You cannot settle all the issues. There will be 5–10% probably to go to other procedures. But my experience tells me 60% is more than 40%, 80% is more than 60%, 100% is nearly impossible. But if you can remove 80% of wrongdoings and fake news and hate speech, you have achieved already a lot.
Absolutely.
I quickly want to add to your example, because you gave with sort of ICANN, because at the same time what we see in ICANN is that a lot of CCTLDs are now adopting the WIPO arbitration procedure. So we are kind of jumping back to established mechanisms to settle disputes on the internet. As I said, there is a lot there. It's just that we have to apply it correctly.
Yes, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, and I fully support you. if you have a wheel, use the wheel. If you think, I have no wheel or my wheel was stolen, then you need a new wheel.
Absolutely. Jackie. Yeah?
On that, Wolfgang, and thank you for bringing up the notion of the wheel. How do we go? I'm Jacqueline Eggenschwiller. Thank you for the hint, Marco. How do we go about designing the wheel if we see the struggles that are apparently real at an intergovernmental level as well as on a company level to agree on fundamental principles, let's say, such as is international law applicable to offenses in cyberspace? How can we create alignment around a mechanism, for example, that everyone subscribes to or the key party subscribe to in terms of enforcement? I wonder how we should go about bridging ideological gaps, maybe there is other gaps, and ideology, I don't mean just political ideology, but also community-based ideology, for example. Thank you.
This will take decades to settle this. You know, the problem here is, and we live in the world where we live in, you miss a political will of key players to come together and to find common solutions. So Bertrand de la Chapelle has this wonderful project on internet in jurisdictions, and the basic idea is to have protocols among states and different jurisdictions, which would allow, you know, to settle a lot of these issues just by following the protocols which link states together, like the TCP/IP protocol links networks. The difference between networks and jurisdictions is networks do not have a political will, but jurisdictions, you know, represented by governments, have a political will. And if you have no political will, you know, it's an illusion then to find the right bridges. The only way out or way forward is to build groups of like-minded countries and to bring good practice, so that the practice is so accepted by a majority of stakeholders that the countries with a bad will or with no will, you know, feel pressure and have no other alternative than to join the club. So this is what Bill Clinton has defined years ago as stumbling forward. So it means no big jump, but small steps, and here a little bit, there a little bit, and then you have a very complex you know, mechanism with a lot of smaller things which can be pulled together like the dots, and this creates a mainstream which could you know, improve the situation in the next 10 years. We are talking about the 2020s. So this has to be done in a process and not as a project.
I'd like to pass over to Jaren now, because I think it might be interesting. I know that Wolfgang was talking a lot about, you know, the challenge of getting people to the table, of how you actually build legitimacy around these processes. And I'd like to pass over to you, Jaren, to share a little bit about how was it with the multi-stakeholder group in Canada, and how do you see this going forward specifically? You said that it has been proliferating across different countries, and it has been very much bottom-up, kind of how do we engage, how do we approach security and trust in IoT. So how do we think about this looking forward, and what are kind of like the best practices in this experience of like actually getting people to the table?
I think the first trick is like being very realistic and picking the right topic. So consumer IoT might not strike as the biggest threat to consumer IoT, to cybersecurity, but it's like, I'll just say 2 words, Mirai botnet. And so the governments needed to do something about it. And the technical community was kind of, I would say, they wanted to act before some sort of unexpected heavy regulation appears, which is a good way to incentivize the businesses, the industry. And of course, the users, they were scared. They were using these devices because it's convenient. It's convenient, it's cool, it's nice, it's hip. We're talking about IoT as still an emerging technology, but it's here to stay, and it's going to evolve. That's why like over-regulating is very tricky. So when we did the when we did the economic analysis of the market, we work with, I really love how you can have an economic explanation to almost everything. So in IoT, it's particularly tricky because first of all, you have information asymmetries. So the level of information between the parties, and sometimes even producers of these devices are not very well informed. They just think that it's the time to go, and there's this constant rush to the market. They want to act quickly because the shelf time is not that long. And also there's this misaligned incentives and some externalities. If your device suddenly turns into a botnet, a part of a botnet, you might not as well notice it. It's your baby cam which might still be working. So what the economics, surprise, surprise, what the economic analysis told us that the multi-stakeholder and collaborative way is still the optimal way to go. So, and regulation also is not the only thing that the governments can do. There are several other options. They can promote responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities. They can use these principles for security and privacy being embedded from the design process in their own procurement processes. And they can also come up with some standards, but as mentioned in the earlier, it's like some minimum level of standards. We've been talking to lots of governments in this process, and some are really keen on regulating like every single little detail, which like probably in 6 months or so, if they're lucky, are not going to be implementable. So everybody has to play a role. And also when we were discussing this among us, there's this risk of, especially when it comes to IoT devices, unless you have some sort of global level of harmonization, countries or communities who are less resourceful might end up with those not so secure devices in the end, which is a whole new level of security divide, and we don't need that kind of divide on top of the already existing divides that we have. So it all makes sense on an economic level. It makes sense. It makes sense on how the internet works. So what the GDPR did, for example, it worked as a really good catalyst for our campaign on a global level. So Europe regulated, but what happened in the end, because Europe is the business partner for almost all the producers of these devices, it all made sense that now we see a convergence of laws around the globe with good data governance principles, including privacy by design. And so when you have this level of harmonization, the rules that you develop by the end of the day are going to work. So you can develop brilliant norms, but if you cannot manage to get it out, if it doesn't make sense on an economic level, on a practical level, and on a global level, because we need this global cooperation as well in order to make norms work. And the biggest problem of international law is based on the notion that all states are equal. So life doesn't work that way in real life, unfortunately. So that's why so there's this reluctance towards more treaties in general. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that really quickly because you mentioned kind of like 2 dimensions. The first you talked about, you know, this global kind of like states level, and you also talked about kind of like a practical level. I wouldn't like to separate them, but just for the purposes of the discussion, I'd like to throw it to you, Marco, on the practical level. What happens then, you know, as we were discussing yesterday, what happens when our Kayla doll in our house is over there and it's already been said that, you know, it's vulnerable, don't have it in your house, but at the same time you have your Alexa over there. And so what happens with this integration? Because that is the very reality of the practical level. Obviously, we should be mindful that not all countries are in the state of, you know, thinking about smart homes, but they are in fact with their devices at hand. They are with smartphones. So how do you see that, Marco?
Yeah, practical terms, you just said it's all interconnected, and that somewhat makes it complex. But I think we shouldn't overthink the problem. As we said earlier, you have that doll in your house, you know it's bad, you should remove it. But what we often also said, and you mentioned Mirai, and what made Mirai so problematic was that we keep using the same components in different devices, and want to bit jump back to what you said in terms of like what can we do in enforcement. What we see from the market is there is an awful lot of reporting going on. What we seem to fail at is learning from those reporting and create, and then let's put the word here on the table, is transparency. If we don't go out there and nail somebody to the wall and say like, seriously, these products are really bad. And they might not be bad for your privacy, but we also have to consider the other side, because the example you gave, Mirai puts the damage somewhere else. You have a perfectly functioning system, but meanwhile somebody else on the internet is struggling to keep his DNS servers alive, and you're like, why does my Twitter not work? Yeah, well, because your webcam is currently attacking your Twitter, and in that sense the interconnection goes around, and in creating that transparency, it would help. We've seen it from other industries, and I do think you raise a good point, because from where I'm standing, the biggest threat to me is consumer electronics. It's the biggest field. It's the least controlled field. I've got far less worries with industrial. Yes, the impact of industrial failure is much bigger, but in industrial systems, there's much more thinking about health and safety. There's much more integrated thinking. Is like, is this really secure what we're doing? And you've got less actors to work with, so that's a much more controllable space. And in terms of consumers, that's really where you need to multi-stakeholders, because we need to get the consumer on board as well to take their role and take their own responsibility in keeping this environment safe. Because sooner or later we're gonna have like the big earthquake and everybody's like, oh, where did my internet go? Well, yeah, it was our fridges or our washing machines.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Marco, you anticipate the question that I had for the panel, actually. We had an interesting debate a few minutes ago on the plenary with Maritia and Yuri, etc., talking about multi-stakeholder versus multilateral. And I heard that, well, this is something that is outdated. We would need to try to merge both stuff, and let's not be ideological. Wow, this is ideological, actually. This is the difference between countries believing that they can continue to regulate something on their own, and then the conception that on the internet we are all interdependent, and that is the multi-stakeholder process. Talking about security and the multi-stakeholder process, even here, the last 2 days, I was surprised to see how many people still see security on one side stuff, and that is inward security, like a very medieval approach, and that is we identify threats there, we build a wall, and we wait for the threats to come, and we can combat it, and we put soldiers on the wall. Well, as you just said, and I was about to say the same, there is outward security. Mirai botnet is a wonderful example. You protect your wall, perfect. I'm protected, but someone use your devices, your system, your everything to attack the Bank of England. And that is something that I believe people should start understanding, that on the internet we are all interconnected and interdependent. And that is, I believe, what also the multi-stakeholder process might bring in. But I would like to hear from you guys. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
You know, in the Global Commission, we introduced a norm which is not our invention, but we think there is a need to distribute this norm more widely, and the norm is called cyber hygiene. So that means we know from our daily practice how important hygiene is, and as an element of security. You cannot avoid illnesses even if you have a very hygiene in your daily practice, but you can reduce the risk level substantially down. And this is not yet the case. If I look into, consequences of cyber attacks or other cybersecurity breaches, 70–80% could have been avoided if all the partners, and not only the end user, but also the service provider, the ISPs, and all elements in this big chain or this big circle, would have followed well-established rules, but they are widely ignored. So I think the famous case, Uri Rosenthal mentioned it in the plenary, of the DNS hijacking in January in Sweden. This was, the negative effects were reduced because the Swedes, had a good hygiene in place. So that means this is a good example and should be more popularized so that people understand they can do a lot of against these attacks if they follow the well-established and known rules. And with this norm, cyber hygiene, and to bring this also more in the media so that the 4 billion end users have an idea. I think people understand even in India and Brazil, if they cross the street with a red light, they risk their life. So, and we do not have such a mechanism in the minds of the 4 billion internet users that if they open their laptop, they should be very careful. So, and this is a common task also of all stakeholders. And, if we talk about multi-stakeholder cooperation, we should, have in mind the aim is the 4 billion end users, and that they work, that the services are correct and safe, and soon we will have 5 billion users. Insofar, if we talk about the role of government, so this is underestimated. Governments are responsible for the educational system. And I really have my doubts after being myself, a teacher at a university, that our educational system is from the industrial age. So it's not prepared for the new challenges of the information age. And it starts with the kindergarten and goes to the universities. And we had no fundamental discussion about the reform of the educational system in the last 10 years. We have something here, something there, but it needs a fundamental new design of the educational system, which would then include cyber hygiene as an important topic. Thank you.
Marco, Jaren, would you like to comment on that?
No, you're absolutely right. I think and cyber hygiene is a good way to describe it, because what we need is a behavioral change. It's fine, but you need to learn to wash your hands. And we talked about the example yesterday. Is you kind of know that you have to cook chicken, and if you eat raw chicken, you're gonna learn the hard way, and next time you'll cook it. It sounds really stupid, but it is. That's what's happening. And to repeat my call also for transparency, people need to understand what they're doing wrong. And a good point, and Henriette isn't here, but she made it in the prep, was also, yeah, we can teach people to wash their hands, but also make sure they have clean water to do so. And that's something that for as a technical community, yes, what we're investing in is capacity building the tools. But in the end, we can build all the tools you want. But if you're not using it, we have firewalls. We know how to. We can teach you how to set safe passwords. But if you don't go in and change your password, there's nothing I can do. Don't look at me. I'm not going to save you.
Just a quick follow-up on that, and perhaps a provocation that we also had is, okay, so we have to be more aware, we have to be more educated, we need to, understand, don't use the same password, don't use 1 2 3 4 5, don't use ABCDE. But what happens, and then I also bring the discussion not only in terms of security awareness, but also in terms of kind of consumer awareness, especially how, we go to the fine line of overburdening the user or overburdening perhaps the consumer with the notion that they should already do XYZ before they actually have acquire a product, or before they have a device that it's actually not safe, even though it says we're all safe. You already did you already, restored your computer. Everything's fine. It's encrypted, but not. So just wanted to leave that there. Just wanted to leave it. We have lots of questions on the floor. That is amazing. I'd like to start out with Zoe Wright. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm from University College London. I'm here part of EuroDIG. I couldn't agree more with the need for digital literacy to enforce digital hygiene as a collective baseline for security. However, My question for the panel is, first, we're overburdening consumers, especially when it comes to IoT security. The UK government is rolling out this IoT labeling scheme. A lot of critics are saying it's too little, too late. And also, I think as a general consensus, consumers are being saturated with data breach reports every day, British Airways losing people's personal data. So there's almost a lack of urgency and priority when it comes to education, because you think consumers have access to all these information already because of the internet, but nothing is standing out. So what is the best way forward to increase this benchmark level of understanding when it comes to privacy and security?
And you gave an interesting example there, because data breaches indeed every day, and we read about them in the newspaper. But where's the person from British Airways explaining what he did wrong to his colleagues to prevent other one from the breach? When today is British Airways, tomorrow it's EasyJet or Air France, and that's what I miss in the current situation. And I think what part of that, and that's part of the enforcement. We tend to think of this as right and wrong, and who does wrong must be punished. And from a private sector perspective, it's all about liabilities. You sit on that secret for as long as possible, because publishing it is a liability, because we are going to come after you and punish. And I think in that sense, in terms of norms and behavior, we might also want to think about that and maybe accept that we are just learning to ride a bicycle. We will fall off occasionally, and the best thing is to keep riding, but also not punish each other or ourselves. Just accept it. This, if we're looking at the next 10 years, this is in its infancy. We haven't seen anything yet, and yet we expect this perfect world. It comes from an engineering thing, but failure is always an option. We have to accept that, and rather than just go after them and punish them, accept that, yes, there was a failure. What can we learn from this failure?
Just one comment on the too much duties for the consumer. You know, if you buy a car, you expect that the car manufacturer gives you a secure car, you know, with an airbag and a seat belt and good brakes. So, but it's up to the driver to use this car in a responsible way. An irresponsible driver can kill other people with a safe car. So that means you have a divided responsibility, and you cannot take away the responsibility from the end user, but certainly the end user should not be responsible, or the driver should not be responsible for the airbag and the seatbelt.
You're absolutely right. Definitely we need more transparency and accountability on a bigger level. And what we particularly tried to do when I mentioned the campaign, we really tried very hard not to say anything, do anything to put additional burden. Because, I mean, unlike cars, IoT devices are not that easy to figure out for the consumers most of the time. And when we're talking about I'm very curious about the outcomes of the ECMS proposal. They are proposing several regulatory options. They already developed this ETSI standard, but it's like going back to my, again, legal nerd side. So law is all about, or regulation, or it's all about distributing liability, balancing interests, and what, especially in continental Europe, you have this like level of behavior that you expect, but that level is different for businesses and for consumers. So from a regular person, you need to act in a reasonable manner. But from businesses, you need to behave as an experienced businessman would do. So it's a higher threshold. So we should never forget about that while trying to find a solution for this. So working on a collaborative manner, that's what we tried to do. We partnered with Consumers International, the biggest consumer organization on a global level. We also talked to the governments for sound policies, which are not necessarily regulation, as I mentioned earlier, and also to raise awareness and the industry to adopt these principles by design. So it cannot be an afterthought, because it's always too late. and there's always going to be a breach. So the only thing that matters is how well prepared you are, and also how transparent you're behaving, because the damage gets worse when you just sit on reports. And from a compliance perspective, it's like the fine that you're going to get if you hide it is going to be bigger too. So it's like, but still, information sharing between the stakeholders during the process, responsible vulnerability sharing is crucial as well.
I just, before we go to the question, I would just like to, I was looking there with the question that Zoe did, and I just saw that Frederick was like, no. Do you agree with that? I was just like, your expression was just like, I don't know if it overburdens the consumer. I'd like to bring it back to you.
Gosh, my body language will kill me.
Yeah, you're spotted.
No,
you're spotted.
I appreciate what you're saying, but I was reacting to what you were saying because, look, we always compare, or often compare, in the internet with climate or the ecology, etc. And I believe there is some good grounds for doing this, because you remember this book comes after the tragedy of commons, and in the ecology, if you just throw your trash in the sea, it will come back to you, you will suffer. Well, the first one who will suffer will be your neighbor. You won't realize it, but at the end of the day, you will suffer. And the internet is just the same. And I believe, yes, we might come back a little bit too often. I don't know how we need to do this, but consumers need to realize that this internet is a common good, and this is just not broadcasting. You're just not taking something. You are contributing to it. You are co-responsible for this. And if you, in front of me, just don't behave in the right way, you might not suffer, but I will. So we are all interdependent. So this is why I was saying, I believe we might come back too often with this message to consumers, but that is a reality. There is a shift in something where we're all co-responsible. This is the basis.
Perfect. Let's go to Wout. Wout, please introduce yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Louise Marie. Wout Natris. I have my own consultancy, and to announce it, we will have a session in the IGF in Berlin exactly on a topic like this. What I am missing often in this sort of discussion is to come back to Wolfgang's example that he said about the safety belts in cars. When did that become obligatory, and how many people flew through the windshield before that actually started happening? And I've been told that it happened because one car company said, we are the ones with the safety belt, and the rest started to follow. But there probably will be lessons there, because now it's law, I'm sure. So how did that get into law? Who started the pressure? Who started to change that? So in my opinion, what is often missing is that with internet standards, they're all there, like Marco said, we have all these standards in place, but why are they not being used? Why are they not being deployed? So that's the question on when industry is not doing it voluntarily, what sort of pressure needs to be put on industry, and by whom, to change their outset. That could be another company that actually will start doing it and being the best example. But the second one is that politicians start to understand what this is about, but that consumer organizations, when they test a new device, don't just look at how smart it looks and how fast it works, but do actually be these standards in place. And then you get all these red little boxes ticked, which is going to show bad compared to others. Or perhaps others will take up the notion, hey, this needs to be changed. And how do we get these people at the table? But this is something which I'm trying to do very hard. And hopefully we'll have this session in Berlin with politicians, with consumer organizations, with industry, and the rest of us here in this room, and try to make sure that that happens. But the question to the panel is, on how do we actually get to engage and actively reach out and make action programs that these people are engaged with and not just talked about?
That's a great point. And just before I pass over to the panel, I think that brings us to kind of like the next part of this discussion, which is what we do when things go wrong. And I think we already touched upon different aspects of it, but since you mentioned the safety belt, I think that's a really interesting analogy for us to think, are we waiting for a big, cyber attack to happen? Because that is definitely kind of like the discourse of, you look at Brad Smith's discourse on, the biggest cyber attack is yet to come, and then we'll need something bigger to respond to that. And then we'll have to raise the awareness of everyone. I think the WannaCry did that a little, but we're still far, far from, is that the way, is that the only scenario where when consumers, when users, when, different sectors that are also getting more digital, transforming themselves, is that the moment when they're actually going to realize? And if that's the moment, what are the tools that we're going to have? So I just wanted to bring that, right? Because I'll give it over to you, Wolfgang, because I know the Commission has published the Singapore norms package specifically, which I think it's a great example of, how to specify different processes such as vulnerabilities, equities processes. So if you could follow up on that with Wout's question in mind as well.
It's impossible to answer the question because the debate about, some people have called it the digital Pearl Harbor, others the digital Hiroshima, others have used other historical analogies. If you look back in history, sometimes you could say, oh yes, mankind needs a disaster to learn from the mistakes. So the hope is always with us that we can avoid a digital disaster and to learn just from anticipation what could happen. So, but the wisdom is an issue which is not fairly distributed among all stakeholders on the globe. In particular, if you look into some governmental circles, they fight battles like in the Middle Ages, and they, insofar the title of the UN report is, very useful, and this fits what Frederick has said. We live in an interdependent world. And, and even if some governments believe they can hit another government, sooner or later this will fire back on themselves. We do not have, like in the nuclear age, the mutual assured destruction, which, kept the level of, let's say, on a certain level, so that we had no nuclear war where the whole world disappeared. And we have not such an instrument like MUD in the digital age. But as Frederick has said, whatever government is doing and believes, we can create harm to our enemy, even it's, you have rights to have an enemy. So, but this will fire back to you. How we can bring this message to the negotiation table now in New York, I think this is important, that Russia, China, the Americans, the Africans, Brazil, India, Europe has to understand they are sitting in one boat. And if somebody tries to bring water into the boat, risk the lives of everybody.
Would any of you like to comment on that? No?
I think I was going to, but Wolfgang wrapped it up. Yeah, we should be careful in polarizing this in right and wrong. We're all in that boat together, and yeah, in that sense, it's mutually assured destruction, but not because party A attacks party B. We've created the beast, and it's gonna all eat us. And unless we train our little dragon, now is the time.
I also think when we're dealing with cybersecurity issues or these breaches, incidents, the last thing we should do is spread paranoia. That would never help. So it's like the narrative that we're using is also important. That's why it's so our experience at Internet Society for the last 2 years working on consumer IoT, focusing on this, it was really eye-opening because it was we were concurrently working with multiple stakeholders at the same time. And now we have established these multi-stakeholder processes and also a platform to share best practices. So it's an ongoing process. It's no silver bullet is going to solve this silver, golden, whatever bullet. Yes, we're in this ship together. This technology is still fascinating. The opportunities still outweigh, in my view. So we should find the right narrative to reach out to every stakeholder and on an economic level to turn secure devices as a competitive advantage. That's the...
I'd like to pass over to the question with the gentleman in the back. Please
Yeah,
present
thank you.
yourself.
Simon van Merkel, Minister of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands. Well, I had a few remarks, but several people made them already, especially my name and just next to me. I heard a lot of remarks about industry, about consumers. I think, well, from my personal experience, a couple of years running around in this whole environment, I think we are trying to solve the whole information society problem in 1.5 hours. And I think there are several aspects. Raising awareness in consumers, being small and medium enterprises or whatever, I think that's very difficult because we are selling them dangerous cars, like you mentioned, but still we expect them to check them everywhere and to drive safely. But then we decided to regulate the safety of the cars. And I think in IT, I don't mention IoT specifically, but in IT in general, or ICT, or whatever term you use, I think we just forgot to regulate. I don't know if I may use the word, being from the ministry, but to regulate the security by design principle. Now, everything is brought on the market. Time to market is short. Business cases are very, very difficult, and we accept on the market everything that is manufactured somewhere in the world. And I think the basics should be safe, and then we can have a second phase, raising awareness to the users. But then the awareness can be very simple, because we have to, I think we as a society, we have to take care that the things are safe by design. I think that's our main challenge, and just we forgot to do that because the business cases and the economies of all countries are very based on what's being sold and what's being used as a service. And since this is a global economy, we are a little bit afraid to take another step and to accept that it might have gone a little bit too fast. So I think that should be on industry and getting them to the table as a stakeholder to take their part and to talk with each other. So I think security should be a competition issue anymore. On consumer, I think we have to indeed take care that we not raise a burden on the consumer, that they just get so much information and they just think, well, it works, it's a nice toy, I can use it, I can get a discount if I hand in my data, and never, who cares? I think that's the situation where we are in. That's one thing. Another remark I would make is, as our community here in the Western-minded world, we are thinking we have our culture and we have our truth. And I think we have to be very careful that other countries in the world, other regions, it was mentioned a couple of times, who are a kind of majority, say, well, dear Western countries, nice try, but we take the authority and now we regulate how it will be. And then our free internet is gone. I think that's a few remarks. It's not necessarily from the minister, it's my personal view.
Any comments on that? Okay, let's keep it going.
I am Sabina. I'm simply here in a private capacity. Well, not so much on the free internet, but all the talk about the seat belts, but also waiting for a big incident got me talking that we're actually looking at different threats on different levels, because from a consumer perspective, the sort of Hindenburg incident might never come. Indeed, we're more in a car safety situation where also one must keep in mind that the personal perception of risk is in no way related to the actual risk, because like if I get on a plane, a lot of people are deathly afraid of doing so. If I get in a car, not so much. But if you look at the actual risk of what we're doing in each case, the reality doesn't match the perception. That is something we might have to keep in mind also when you look into regulation, indeed, of consumer products, that people feel a lot safer or might feel a lot safer than they actually are. And on the other hand, I'm not sure I agree with Wout that sort of a car or that seat belts might have been a unique selling point. I think, I mean, still, if you look at older generations, people hate putting them on. They feel infringed in their personal comfort and their personal freedom and so on. But indeed, it showed that they work. They protect you from death. They protect you from injuries. So, like bit by bit, I don't know. They were introduced, and I think they're here to stay. So sometimes you must also, I guess, assume a perspective of not just what does the customer want, what do they feel most comfortable with, but indeed what is in the interest also of sort of the herd immunity when we come back to that cyber hygiene aspect. I think this is a great way of looking at it. We have a lot of low-level risks, but for a large number of people.
Quick response, because I think you forgot one important point there. So let's not forget to regulate behavior. If you're not wearing your seatbelt, It's you who get the fine, not the car manufacturer. If you don't send your car to the MOT to hook up to Simon's example, you get the fine, not the manufacturer. And I think that's part of, again, back to sort of the principles of Tunis, each and everybody in their respective roles. There is a role here for the user, there is a role here for the consumer, and there is a role here essentially for law enforcement to where that user exceeds its boundaries to regulate that behavior.
And I think just to provoke, and I'll pass over the question to the next participant. I think this asymmetry of perception specifically is very interesting because you were saying that there is a perception of risk at the user level, which is very much not the perspective of the real risk. Do we actually know what the real risk is? So I'll just leave it that and give it to you.
Thank you very much. I'm not a European. I'm from Taiwan and you're from Asia. I think I have a couple points, and I think this is a wonderful session and a really excellent dialogue in between the peoples. I think first of all is don't forget how we are living in a world with a lot of law existing already. It's not. We are not living in the world is no law at all. And first of all, I think if you violate and can be justified, it's harm the people or private property, or for example about privacy, or the that kind of thing, you still violate the law. The law is still there. Don't assume there is no law at all. That's the first point. And actually, I think Wolfgang talking about using the car as an example is an interesting thing. I have a couple of the comment about that. One is when the car have a seatbelt, have an airbag, because we have very good scientific testing. We know that it's effective, it works. The difficulty when we are talking about put the regulation into the cyberspace, to be honest, is that we don't have evidence to make sure they work. So be careful. You put into a regulation into the cyberspace and you are not sure that is effective and that is work. It could be very possible to damage the user or, for us itself. So I think that is my point, is unless you really have evidence, you have effective and it work, put a regulation, you just put yourself in the risk.
The copyright regulation of the European Union is a good example.
Okay, technical community speaking here. I can give you a direct answer. What's the risk here? I'm one of the 12 root server operators. At current, there are 993 instances of DNS root server. I don't even know. I have to talk to my colleagues to find out what the current background noise is. But I'll bet you next year there will be 2,000 DNS root servers, because we need to keep up with sort of the continuous hammering of all these vulnerable devices that send us junk. And we're going to end up with 5,000 instances. And somebody's going to foot the bill. And it's probably not the one buying the television. Well, not directly. Eventually they're going to pay for it, but one way or another. But currently it's my members footing that bill, partially. And we keep adding instances and we keep adding capacity to that network just to keep up. And I'm not sure we're going to win that weapons race.
Weapons race. Okay, over to you.
Thank you for the talks. I agree with so much of what you've said, but I also disagree slightly as well. My background is law enforcement, and now I work for a cybersecurity company. I think we've had critical incidents already, but people just label them differently. There was an attack on the NHS in the UK that disabled the systems for 2 days. I think that's not quite 0 day, We've had the attacks on elections. I think these are all critical events that people forget and trying to gloss over. And I do agree about the IoT things, but there's these big things happening that we just don't talk about enough. I think that we do need regulation and strong regulation because there's manufacturers that don't take it as seriously as we do. If a company can build planes and say we're going to do software updates after 2 planes have crashed, there's something going very wrong. And then what I do like what you're talking about is ideas, but what are the practicalities? Some of these are very aspirational. What would you say we need to do in the next 24 months to say this is going to change things? But also then, if those are the things you want to happen in 24 months, what are the measurements to say that they've worked or haven't worked? Because that's something we don't do either.
I mean, that is the million-dollar question. And I'll pass over the challenge to the panelists and to whoever in the room wants to react to that question as well, because I do think that it's definitely a collective effort of thinking about how do we measure the effectiveness of, how do we respond? How do we measure the effectiveness of the responses that we have so far? Is it regulation that will actually provide us with better safeguards, either in terms of developing protocols for responding to incidents, or either in creating spaces for cooperation or instances where we have to cooperate? So yeah, I'll just pass it over to the panelists. Anyone wants to start with that?
A good current example, airplanes. Usually these kind of disasters, these kind of very big disasters don't happen because of a single thing go wrong. It's a sequence of events. And back to my point is we need to learn what went wrong here, because as people are still investigating, but partially emerged that yes, the regulation was there, but actually the regulator told people to tick the box yourself. Well, that might not be a good way to enforce your regulation. Back to the NHS example, yes, it wasn't a 0 day, so there was a patch available. Why it wasn't in the system is the second question we need to ask. But then also in that term, again, we have to all change behavior, because these 0 days are actively traded by people who think it's a weapon to somebody else. And that's from an industry perspective quite problematic. If somebody finds a 0 day, rather than call the manufacturer, put it out on the market and sell it to another government. I can't keep up. That's something I will never ever win from. Don't ask me to improve my products if you don't tell me how to have vulnerability.
I'll try again. It's a difficult one, but it's like there might be several indicators that will show success. So what we aim in general is, as you said, behavioral change. So consumers somehow shifting the market for better products, for more secure products. So eventually we'll have less. It's like we can never promise 0 incidents, 0 breaches. That's just not realistic. But it will be less damage. It will be less in number. And also we can always say that it's like the minimum standards imposed perhaps through regulation or other kind of processes. So security, privacy, at least from an IoT perspective, which would improve the overall security of the internet infrastructure. And another discussion topic is like most of the stuff we talk about around cybersecurity and around internet regulation instead of internet governance is things happening which are already illegal under several existing laws, which are happening on the application layer. So what's happening to the infrastructure when you try to regulate these incidents, these cases, is another issue to look forward, because there might be some unintended consequences with regulations that with totally good intentions. I'm not naming or blaming anything.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to, yeah, sure.
Yes, it's all now. Thanks, Simon. Wouter Natis again. I'd like to respond to the comment the gentleman in front of me made. Just to add to that, I think if you lived in the Ukraine in the winter of 2017 or 18, I can't remember what year, when the electricity went down for, I don't know, for days, perhaps weeks on end, you had your doomsday scenario if you lived there. But somehow that doesn't really affect the rest of the world, and certainly personally not myself. So in other words, there will be instances and examples for certain parties that actually have gone through a very serious incident, except how do you translate that to a world level? The other one is on measuring. I think that it was in 2006 that our State Secretary of Economic Affairs said we need to do something about botnet mitigation. And it took 7 years for the center to open. But what it did is actually they got everybody on board because the ministry funded the startup. The .nl SIDN registry said we'll host the device for you so that the market didn't have any cost. But what they coupled to it was measurement. So they asked the University of Delft to actually come up with yearly reports on does this actually work. And that's how you can change something by a little incentive from the government, but making sure that the good guys and the bad guys are starting to stand out. And after a few words, they started to name and shame in the reports. In other words, there was pressure put on the market to actually start cooperating on a tool that was made available. And I think that that's an example how you can actually measure results from what the government says this is a good direction to move into and facilitate that. So perhaps there are other examples in the world that could be shared, that could be used by others to copy, for example.
Anyone wants to comment on that? I just wanted to throw the ball back to Wolfgang, because I know and I've been on several of the hearings or the outreach of the Global Commission. So I was just wondering, Wolfgang, how was it in terms of kind of like actually getting other stakeholders on board? I was there over at ICANN. I saw over at the Global Conference on Cyberspace. So how was it to actually get other parties to understand? Because some of these norms actually kind of like re-echo a lot of what we have been talking over here. So why don't we just actually take them forward? So how was it for you, Wolfgang, as a commissioner to see that going forward?
Yeah, that's indeed a problem, that we have now so many different initiatives, and this, natural wish and interest, to create an environment which, promotes security in cyberspace on the various levels, the state level, the business level, the technical level, and so on, has led to this many different initiatives, Siemens with the Charter of Trust, Microsoft with the Tech Accord, and the Telefonica with the New Deal. And now we will see soon the Cyber Peace Institute. We have here the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise in The Hague. So meanwhile, there are dozens of different initiatives. And when we started work with the Commission, do we add another element to it? What I see from the experience we had 10, 15 years ago in the Internet governance community, when everybody was talking about principles for Internet governance, we had dozens of initiatives. The Council of Europe adopted a ministerial declaration. The OECD adopted principles for Internet policy making. And we had in Bali in the IGF in 2013 a workshop with 15 different instruments on principles for Internet governance. This is confusing for the broader public. So, and the conclusion was from the Bali meeting, we have to look into various initiatives. All have their limitations. A number are only supported by one stakeholder group, like governments or the civil society. Others are just for the region. And the outcome was, okay, can we create something which is multi-stakeholder and global? And the result was the Net Mundial Declaration. So it was pushed forward by Snowden and the need for the JANA transition. But finally, now we have a document, which is the Net Mundial Declaration, which is global, which is multi-stakeholder. And the best reference point we have so far for internet governance in general. And this is what I see now with the cybersecurity discussion, that we are moving to a certain moment where then we have to come, probably in 2 or 5 years from now, probably in 2025, when we have the next World Summit on the Information Society. This is +20. It's not yet decided how to organize this meeting, but this is already decided that we have a meeting in 2025, so only 5 years to go. And, you know, to bring this on various initiatives into I defined this process of enhanced communication, not enhanced cooperation, so that people talk to each other and filter out what is needed, so that this is for the whole globe and involves all stakeholders. So, and the UN panel with the proposal to have a global call for trust and security in cyberspace, which reflects a little bit or mirrors the Paris call, which is already on the table, so is the next step, and probably we can, bring all these various initiatives into a general framework, which would then allow to deal with the very single specific issues, because you cannot manage the whole cybersecurity issues in one big treaty. You can have a big framework, but then you have to go to the individual issues, and also the proposal made by Uri Rosendahl in the previous session to single out the protection of the public core of the internet and to declare attacks against the root server system, the DNS, the IP address system, routers, servers, satellites, cables, as a crime against humanity, because the whole humanity is dependent on the internet. Could be a first step. It's a small step, but it would be a first cornerstone to build in the 2020s a whole cybersecurity architecture, which would include a number of smaller individual treaties, not a big treaty, smaller treaties, so that you can handle this case by case, issue by issue, and this would then constitute, in the next 10 years, a framework for cybersecurity.
Thank you. I think we are about to wrap up, but before we wrap up, I would just like to say that the objective of this session was mainly for us to really try to get the perspective of how do we look forward and how do we also bend, the bridges, how do we build the bridges between this kind of like international norms discussion and kind of like the very practical, as we stayed a lot of time in the discussion talking about the user, about the consumer, about what are the types of safeguards. Should we just go for self-regulation? What are we looking in the next 10 years? What is the type of regulation, if any, are we looking at as we look forward? What kind of security do we want to see for the next 10 years? How do we respond effectively? How do we build specific measurements? How do we know how to implement? So I think the main question over here was, how do we connect these two different levels, which are not necessarily detached from each other, but are definitely in two different narratives. So how do we make them converge? So that was pretty much the effort over here. And I'd just like to pass to our rapporteur for the three main points of our session. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Stefania, and I work for the Geneva Internet Platform. We are producing reports from all the sessions, independent reports from all the sessions, and we also produce the 5 messages. Can you? These are the messages from this workshop that will be sent to the Secretariat, but I need a rough consensus before sending it to the Secretariat. So the first message is all stakeholders need to be represented at the table in their respective roles. Despite some issues have to be settled by specific expertise-based stakeholder group, conclusion can only be reached if all the stakeholders' perspectives are taken into account. To this extent, inclusive multilateralism could address the current tension between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. Is there consensus on this? What do you think? Yes. Current technological challenges have created a global appetite for further regulation. Nevertheless, flexibility is needed in understanding, on a case-by-case, whether further regulation is needed. Some of the challenges currently hampering the regulatory policy-making process are related to the false dichotomy that privacy and security are in contrast with each other. Security and privacy by design can be a solution. The current approach has promoted self-regulation. Debates on effective regulation need to consider and implement stronger enforcement mechanisms, which existing institutions and tools are lacking. In the absence of an independent judiciary for cyberspace, new mechanisms for dispute settlement should complement existing legal frameworks. Following this line, the implementation of best practices by like-minded countries can further strengthen the adoption of responsible behavior to a large number of actors. In order to address the challenges posed by emerging technologies, better transparency and accountability mechanisms are required. Digital literacy, security, and consumer awareness need to be implemented for a better, effective, holistic approach. Is it okay?
Paul, right?
Thank you. Paul Blaker from the UK government. First of all, thank you very much for a really good discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I learnt a lot from this discussion, and thanks very much to the panelists. I have just one comment on this, which is the last sentence of the first paragraph. I'm not sure that we had a very developed discussion of this idea of inclusive multilateralism. I personally am not sure what it means still. I think we need a bit to talk about that a little bit more. It sounds a little bit like a contradiction in terms to me, so I think I wouldn't personally include that in the messages coming out, because I don't think we covered it in our discussion. Thank you.
I think it was you, right, Wolfgang, that mentioned that, and I think it's more about you're bringing the example of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, and we can just leave it at multi-stakeholder if that's okay with everyone. I believe we have greater consensus on that, and I think that's perfect. I'd like to thank you all for the great participation. I hope it was as enriching for us as it was for you, and I'd like to personally thank just all of the panelists. I am really honored to have you here, and Tanya again for the great help in all of this. Thank you all for being here, and look forward to the next EuroDIG.